Welcome back, fellow deep divers. Today we're diving into one of those books you always hear about. You know, the one that's supposed to be brilliant, but maybe a little intimidating.
You're talking about James Joyce's Ulysses.
That's the one, Ulysses. And luckily, we have a trusty guide to help us navigate the complexities. We've got the Cliffs Notes for Ulysses, so no need to feel overwhelmed.
Definitely. This CliffsNotes guide, I think, will make a great companion. It breaks down the novel structure, gives us some really interesting character analyses, and helps us understand a bit about Joyce himself and the historical and literary landscape he was working in.
Right. So in this deep dive, we're hoping to do a few things. We want to shed some light on how the novel is structured, it's a bit unique, and how it cleverly draws parallels to Homer's Odyssey. We'll also meet the key characters, especially the ones we encounter early on. And of course, we'll start to unpack some of the major themes Joyce is exploring.
Sounds good. And remember, folks, we're aiming to keep this conversation engaging and insightful without getting bogged down in academic jargon.
Exactly. No need to be a Joyce scholar to appreciate what he's doing here. But before we jump into the thick of it, let's get a sense of how Ulysses is actually put together, shall we?
Okay, so first off, something that might surprise some folks is that Joyce didn't actually divide Ulysses into neat, numbered chapters, the way we usually see it, with sections like Telemachus or Nestor. That comes from a scholar named Stuart Gilbert, and it's mostly for convenience.
Ah, so that's why those chapter titles sound so classical, like they're straight out of Greek mythology.
Exactly, and that's because they are. Joyce intentionally structured Ulysses to mirror the episodes in Homer's Odyssey. It's what the CliffsNotes calls his mock heroic purpose. It's like he's taking the ordinary lives of these Dubliners and, by linking them to this ancient epic, he's elevating their experiences to a grand mythic level.
Okay, I'm starting to see how Joyce plays with this. Like, it's not a direct one-to-one retelling of the Odyssey. It's more like he's using it as a kind of blueprint, a framework to explore modern life.
You've got it. So let's look at how this actually plays out. The very first section, as we said, is called Telemachus. Now, Telemachus in the Odyssey is Odysseus' son. And in Ulysses, we meet Stephen Dedalus in this section, waking up in the Martello Tower with Buck Mulligan and Haynes. The guide makes this really interesting connection. They suggest that Stephen, feeling forced to leave the tower by Haynes and Mulligan, is like Telemachus who has to leave Ithaca because of the suitors vying for his mother's hand.
Interesting. But Stephen's not exactly sailing off to find a lost father figure, is he?
Not in the literal sense, no. But the theme of fatherhood, both in a physical and maybe even a more spiritual sense, is definitely on Stephen's mind. What's also interesting is that Stephen's departure from the tower isn't as decisive as Telemachus leaving Ithaca. He even gives Mulligan the key. It's only later, after an argument, that Stephen decides not to return. So the Homeric parallel is there, but Joyce is already twisting it, making it his own.
Right, right. I see what you mean. It's more about echoing the Odyssey, riffing on it, than just copying it.
Hmm.
And the fact that each section of Ulysses has a title corresponding to an episode in the Odyssey, like, Nestor, Proteus, Calypso, that really emphasizes this ongoing connection, even if it's not always a perfect match.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, since we've touched on some of these characters already, let's delve a bit deeper into who they are. We meet three main characters fairly early on: Stephen Dedalus, Buck Mulligan, and then a little later, Leopold Bloom. And the glitch notes provide some really sharp insights into these characters right off the bat.
Let's start with Stephen. He's the first one we encounter, right there in the Telemachus episode. What are some of the initial things we notice about him?
Well, right away, you get the sense that Stephen is carrying some heavy emotional baggage. He's grieving his mother, who died less than a year before the events of the novel. And he's feeling incredibly guilty about refusing to pray at her bedside when she was dying. The guide also points out that Stephen is incredibly introspective, almost detached from what's happening around him. He's described as a visionary and a blind prophet, literally because he broke his glasses the day before, so he's walking around with impaired vision.
Wow, so he's literally and figuratively blind in a way. Interesting how that ties in with his intellectual and artistic side. He's kind of turning inward, focusing on his thoughts and perceptions.
Yeah, and this physical blindness, it might even be a symbol, right? Like Stephen deliberately turning away from the external world and all its distractions.
I like that. Okay, and then we have Buck Mulligan. Now, he seems like the opposite of Stephen in many ways.
Oh, absolutely. Mulligan is a Dublin medical student who's living in the Martello Tower with Stephen, and he's loud, boisterous, kind of insensitive. He mocks Stephen's Greek name, constantly brings up his mother's death and the fact that he didn't pray for her, which just makes Stephen feel worse. and he's always ready to borrow money from Stephen.
So not exactly the most supportive roommate.
No, not really. But the guide also points out that Mulligan is very much a man of action. He loves swimming in the cold Irish Sea. In fact, he even saved someone from drowning once. He's very much focused on the physical world, the here and now, especially if the here and now involves a good drink and some company.
So we've got the introspective, guilt-ridden Stephen and the outgoing, maybe even a little reckless Mulligan. Quite a pair. And then there's Leopold Bloom. We don't meet him until later in the Calypso section. What's our first impression of him?
Well, it's a stark contrast to the somewhat tense atmosphere we see with Stephen and Mulligan. We first encounter Bloom at home, in a domestic setting. He's making breakfast for his wife Molly, who's still asleep. And right away, we get this sense of him as a caring, considerate person, very down to earth. And his thoughts reveal that he's concerned about getting older and about his Jewish heritage, which, in predominantly Catholic Dublin, makes him stand out.
Right. So even in these early introductions, we start to see these distinct personalities and concerns taking shape. Stephen grappling with his internal demons, Mulligan with his zest for life, and Bloom with this quiet, everyday humanity. And then there's Molly. We don't actually meet her directly in these early sections, but we feel her presence, don't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the Cliffs Notes makes a point of highlighting this. They describe her as Joyce's earth goddess, even comparing her to Chaucer's wife of Bath, a character known for being strong-willed, sensual, and experienced in the ways of the world. Even though she doesn't appear directly until much later, her presence is woven into the thoughts and actions of both Stephen and Bloom from the very beginning.
Yeah, like she's this sort of unseen force shaping their lives, even when she's not physically there. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the major themes and recurring images or motifs that start to emerge in these early sections.
One of the most prominent themes, and one that's directly linked to the Homeric parallel, is the idea of the lost or false father. We see this in Stephen's thoughts on paternity, both physical and maybe even spiritual, in Telemachus. And it continues in Proteus, where Stephen actually questions who his true father is. Is it Simon Dedalus, his biological father, or perhaps something more abstract, like a guiding principle or idea?
Right. It's like he's searching for something more than just a biological father, maybe a mentor, a source of inspiration, a connection to something bigger than himself.
Exactly. And the guide also points to another recurring motif, the idea of Ireland as a kind of dried up, depleted land. We see this image in Telemachus with the old milk woman who visits the tower. And it plays into the feeling of stagnation and disillusionment that many Irish people felt at the time under British rule.
Yeah, that sense of being trapped, both politically and maybe even spiritually. And then there's the motif of the key, which Stephen just hands over to Mulligan. Could that be symbolic of something?
Definitely. It could represent a loss of control, a surrender of his place in the tower, or maybe even a symbolic severing of ties with his past. Yep. And then we have the water motif, which pops up in various forms.
Oh yeah, water. That seems significant. What do you make of it?
Well, in Telemachus, we have Mulligan swimming confidently in the sea, which might represent his vitality, his connection to the physical world. And then there's Stephen, who's actually afraid of water. Maybe it's tied to some past trauma, or maybe it symbolizes his anxieties, his fear of being overwhelmed by life.
And then in Nestor, the water imagery is connected to Stephen's mother and her death. There's even that disturbing image of green bile, which is just unsettling.
Right, so water becomes this multifaceted symbol. It represents life and death, cleansing, and danger. It mirrors the emotional complexities of the characters.
I'm seeing a pattern here. Joyce seems to love using these everyday objects and images to convey deeper meanings. And speaking of everyday things, money also seems to be a prominent theme.
Yeah, you're right. In Nestor, we see Mr. Deasy's his reverence for money. He's the headmaster of the school where Stephen teaches, and he really believes in the power of money. And then we see Stephen struggling with his own meager salary.
That contrast is stark. And it also ties into the idea of greed and corruption, which was a big concern for Irish nationalists at the time.
Right. And speaking of Ireland and its history, there's this powerful phrase that appears in Nestor. History is a nightmare.
Ooh, that's a good one. What do you think Joyce is getting at with that?
Well, it works on a couple of levels. For Stephen, it refers to his personal history, the trauma of his mother's death, and the guilt he still carries. But it also refers to Ireland's history, its long struggle under British rule, which Stephen desperately wants to break free from.
Right. So we've got personal and national history intertwined, both weighing heavily on Stephen. It's impressive how Joyce is already weaving together all these seemingly disparate elements: grief, politics, even everyday objects like a key into this rich and layered tapestry. And beyond the themes and motifs, we're also starting to see these contrasting perspectives and ideas emerging, aren't we?
Absolutely. The difference between Mulligan, who's very outward focused and lives in the moment, and Stephen, who's more introspective and burdened by the past, that's a major contrast. And then in Nestor, we have Mr. Deasy with his rather prejudiced views. He makes some anti-Semitic remarks. He's dismissive of women and very pro-British. And these views clash with what we're starting to understand about Stephen's intellectualism and later Bloom's more accepting nature.
It's like Joyce is setting up these ideological battles from the very beginning. And it's interesting how their initial settings also reflect their personalities.
Mm.
You know, Stephen in the tense, chaotic environment of the tower, and Bloom in this quiet, domestic space.
Exactly. And speaking of interesting details, let's not forget about Bloomsday itself.
Yeah.
The fact that the entire novel takes place on June 16th,
Oh,
1904.
Bloomsday. Why that particular day?
Well, the Cliffs Notes tells us that June 16th is believed to be the day Joyce first realized his love for Nora Barnacle, who he would later marry. So it's a day of personal significance for him, and it kind of infuses this otherwise ordinary day with a deeper meaning, a sense of destiny.
Wow, that's a cool detail. It's like he's taking this personal moment and using it to illuminate the epic within the everyday. And there are other seemingly small details that stand out, like Stephen's broken glasses, for example.
Yeah, that's not just a random detail. The fact that he broke his glasses the day before, it impacts how he experiences the world throughout the day, literally and figuratively. It reinforces his role as the observer, the intellectual who's maybe a little bit removed from the physical world. And then there's the fact that he's wearing black because of his mother's death. This detail will actually echo later on when Bloom also wears black for Patty Bigham's funeral, creating a subtle connection between them, even though they're mourning for different reasons.
I like how those small details create these subtle echoes and connections. And then there's Bloom's background as a Hungarian Jew in Dublin. That immediately sets him apart.
Absolutely. He's an outsider in a society that's predominantly Catholic and Irish. And this theme of otherness, of belonging and not belonging, becomes a major thread throughout the novel. And finally, the guide points out this interesting connection between Molly and Calypso, the nymph who holds Odysseus captive in the Odyssey.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, Molly was born in Gibraltar, and some proponents of the Irish literary revival, a cultural movement happening at the time, believed that Gibraltar was actually the location of Calypso's island, Ogygia. It's not clear if Joyce himself believed this, but he was definitely aware of the association. And it adds another layer to this intricate web of Homeric references he weaves throughout the novel.
It's amazing how much depth and meaning Joyce packs into these seemingly small details. So as we wrap up this initial deep dive, what are the key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind about these opening sections of Ulysses?
Well, we've only just scratched the surface, but hopefully you now have a better understanding of how the novel is structured. Particularly that clever interplay with the Odyssey, how Joyce uses it as a framework but also subverts it. And we've met the main players, Stephen, Bloom, and the unseen but ever-present Molly, and we've started to unravel some of the big themes. The search for a father figure, the state of Ireland, the burden of history.
And we've also seen how Joyce uses these really striking contrasts between characters, between settings, between ideas to create this incredibly rich and layered world.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how these initial encounters and themes will play out as Bloom and Stephen's paths inevitably cross later in the day. How will those feelings of alienation and the longing for connection manifest? The tapestry of Ulysses, with all its complexities and rewards, is truly just beginning to unfold.
That's a great way to put it. And it raises a question for our listeners to ponder. How do you think those early experiences that Stephen and Bloom go through, those individual struggles, might actually lead them towards each other? What kind of understanding or maybe misunderstanding could arise from their very different perspectives and backgrounds?
That's something to think about. And if any of these early details sparked your interest, the Homeric connections, Bloom as this modern-day Ulysses, or Stephen's inner turmoil of the Cliffs Notes, is a great resource to explore further. And remember,